Milwaukee, 1991. The city was a place like many others, quiet, ordinary, with its fair share of troubles. But beneath the surface, a dark shadow loomed, one that many had yet to notice. For years, men had been vanishing without a trace. The disappearances were brushed aside, written off as runaways or people simply leaving town. But for the families of the missing, the pain of uncertainty and fear was unrelenting. In truth, the disappearances were far from random. They were the work of one man, a man who had lived among them, unnoticed, blending into society like a shadow. His name was Jeffrey Dahmer, a man known for his quiet demeanor, his disarming charm, and the terror he unleashed behind closed doors. Yet even as his collection of crimes grew, Dahmer continued to fly under the radar, a predator stalking his prey with chilling precision. Everything changed on the night of July 22, 1991. Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man who had crossed paths with Dahmer, would make a choice that would alter the course of history. Edwards had been lured into Dahmer's apartment, a place that would become the scene of horrors he could never forget. Dahmer, as he had done countless times before, promised Edwards companionship, drugs, and alcohol. But this time something was different. Edwards wasn't like the others. Something inside him told him to leave, to get out before it was too late. But Dahmer had other plans. Edwards found himself trapped in a nightmare when Dahmer tried to handcuff him and attempt to restrain him for what was to come. With fear coursing through his veins, Edwards broke free, ran for his life, and screamed for help. Covered in bruises, terrified, he managed to flag down 2 police officers nearby. His story was a chilling one. The man who had tried to kill him was Jeffrey Dahmer. The officers didn't believe him at first, thinking he might be under the influence of drugs. But Edwards persisted, showing them where Dahmer lived. He led them to apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street, where a nightmare waited to be uncovered. Inside the apartment, the officers discovered a scene more horrifying than they could have imagined. As they entered, they found photographs of dismembered bodies, skeletal remains, and a slew of disturbing trophies, pieces of human flesh, skulls, and bones. The apartment was a grisly crime scene filled with remnants of Dahmer's monstrous acts. His past was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was laid bare before them in the most grotesque way. The world was stunned. Jeffrey Dahmer, a quiet man who kept to himself, was revealed to be the monster behind the disappearances. His chilling collection of body parts, photographs, and other sickening mementos told the story of his long reign of terror. Dahmer had been operating in plain sight, blending into society, manipulating his victims, and leaving no traces until now. It was in those first few hours after Dahmer's arrest that investigators began to piece together the scale of his crimes. They learned that Dahmer had been luring men into his home for years, offering them alcohol, drugs, and companionship. His victims were often young, vulnerable, and isolated, easy targets for a man who had mastered the art of deception. Dahmer's first known victim, Stephen Hicks, had been lured to his apartment in 1978. Dahmer, still a young man, had drugged and strangled Hicks, then dismembered his body. This would become his twisted pattern, each victim falling prey to the same horrific fate. Over the years, Dahmer refined his methods, learning how to avoid detection. He would dismember his victims and keep their body parts as macabre trophies, storing them in his apartment, or at times, cooking them. But Dahmer didn't just murder for pleasure. He sought control, seeking to manipulate his victims in the most intimate and horrifying ways. His need for dominance over their bodies was reflected in the brutal manner in which he carried out his killings. Many of his victims were drugged, unconscious, and left powerless, unable to fight back. As the investigation into Dahmer's crimes deepened, the true scope of his horror came to light. Police found evidence that suggested Dahmer had murdered at least 17 men over the span of 13 years, each death marked by the same chilling ritual. His choice of victims was not random. Many were gay men, some with troubled pasts, making them less likely to be missed or searched for. Dahmer had learned to prey on the marginalized, those who wouldn't immediately be reported missing. The police had missed the signs time and time again. Dahmer's odd behavior, his strange interactions with neighbors, and the faint odor that sometimes escaped from his apartment all went unnoticed. The neighbors had whispered about him, the man who kept to himself, who seemed a little off, but no one dared to confront him. Dahmer had successfully kept his darkest secrets hidden, until Tracy Edwards' desperate escape exposed them all. In the weeks following Dahmer's arrest, the media erupted with stories about his crimes. The public was horrified as details emerged about how he had lured his victims, the gruesome methods he used to kill them, and the horrifying trophies he kept. The chilling interviews with Dahmer, in which he confessed to the murders, only deepened the sense of unease. He was cold, emotionless, his voice lacking any trace of remorse. For many, it was as if Dahmer had never truly seen his victims as people but merely objects to satisfy his twisted desires. When Dahmer's trial began in 1992, it shocked the world. The courtroom was filled with victims' families, reporters, and spectators. Dahmer sat there, silent, his face betraying little emotion as the charges were read aloud. His defense team argued that he was insane, but the evidence was overwhelming. Dahmer was convicted of 15 murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His cold demeanor during the trial and his lack of remorse left the nation in disbelief. How could someone like Dahmer, who seemed so ordinary on the outside, be capable of such unspeakable acts? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as Dahmer was locked away in a maximum security prison. But for the families of his victims, justice came too late. No amount of prison time could undo the horrors Dahmer had inflicted on their loved ones. Their pain, their loss, would never be truly healed. Dahmer's capture may have brought some sense of closure to the city, but for the victims' families, the darkness of the past would never truly fade. In 1994, just 2 years after his conviction, Dahmer's life came to an end in prison. He was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, a tragic and fitting end for a man who had wreaked so much havoc on the lives of others. Yet, even in death, Dahmer left behind a chilling legacy, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most unassuming faces. Today, the name Jeffrey Dahmer still sends chills down the spines of those who remember his crimes. His story serves as a haunting reminder of the monsters that sometimes walk among us, hidden in plain sight. The silence they keep is the deadliest of all, and the damage they leave behind is impossible to erase. Dahmer's reign of terror may have ended, but the scars he left on the world will never fade.